Good afternoon, almost evening. I know you're all already tired, but please keep the most power as you have now. I'm an architectural historian and architect myself, and I'm working in this castle as a director. It's a part of Vilnius Art Academy. And I haven't done any big research on the parks, actually. So I really don't like when the directors are coming and giving presentations. I said, I will never do that, but now I'm doing. So it's all I'm going to present, it was done by the team of restorers of park researchers. So I will just give you a brief review, and I will share in the end, challenges. It's very nice. I'm very grateful about Dr. Edgar Kaskia, who gave a short presentation what is Enlightenment Park. So you already know that. I'm not going to repeat. And so it's mostly, the castle which I'm going to represent. It's in Lithuania, and it has a long development, but the most focus is around the 18th century. So this is what I'm going to mostly focus on, and the castle has a legacy of those several eras. And so in the 17th and 18th century, when the Eperjes, Hungarian origin family, owned the estate for 150 years, there were gardens, ponds, a menagerie, a forest surrounded by the residence. You can see here those 4 towers by the biggest river, Neman, Memel, which all the river was mentioned today. And it is fairly well known that the gardens were in the surroundings of Panemunė Castle almost since the construction in 1604. And it was a regular garden with the Baroque features characteristic of the period, of course. Maybe this book was already known, which was presented in the last session, but nothing survived from that time. The only historical source, actually, that talks about the fact of the regular presence of the Baroque gardens is from mid-18th century inventory of the castle, when it was acquired by the Swedish origin noble family, only for 7 years, actually. And it was mentioned in this document, gardens with fruit trees, actually 3 gardens, and at least some of which were probably preserved during later, when the gardens were remodeled. There were also ponds and other features mentioned in this document. One of the team members which work on the project, on the garden restoration, has a hypothesis that so this is the general how the view looks like. The castle is on the slightly hill, surrounded by previously it was 3 buildings in the Renaissance, but later it became U-shaped building in the 18th century. And this, for example, it was just a defending wall, but later it was remodeled into a wing. So that's why you see the windows in the middle of the wall. And so the restorer of this, one of the restorers raised the hypothesis. You can see in the red square highlighted image of the door with the arch, a Renaissance arch, leading to the south side. And according to the restorer, this might be the entrance for the former Renaissance/Baroque gardens on the south terrace down the hill. So this later entrance was closed, and you see now the staircase on the right. In 18th century, it was changed, the entrance. And actually with the artist, because as they said, the castle is a part of the Art Academy, and the whole restoration concept, not restoration, just trying the park to make comfortable for the users to use, for the visitors to use. So we have no plans to remake the Renaissance garden, but artists have an inspiration. So this is land art from the previous year. They took the 16th century book of the garden art, and with the collected leaves, and they made these Renaissance labyrinth. And from the tower, it was quite spectacular, actually. For 1 week, it was still an idea to, how it could look like, at least one of those 3 which might be downstairs. And so in the mid-18th century, where I stopped before, the castle was acquired by another noble family, Gelgut, the local family. And the castle, as you already saw, it was partly rebuilt, and it got classical appearance. The architecture from exterior little changed, but the interior drastically changed. I would love to talk another paper only about interiors, which are very colorful and not a black like the castle from the outside. And the gardens actually were very much changed. And I would like to show you a very recent, this is just, this year was discovered, so it's a very fresh, I never talk actually in a scientific conference about it. So one neighbor's actually on the opposite side of the river, another manor house who discovered, so they share with us, and a colleague of mine, he translated it into Lithuanian, but I'm not gonna tell what it's about, but basically it's it was written in 1774, and it was published in a monastery newsletter, newspaper, and it was a kind of a beautiful epigram dedicated to the Mrs. Eleonora Gelgut, so the daughter of the owner of the castle, and in this epigram, it was kind of trying to emphasize the big work she did on doing reconstruction of the Panemunė hill, the castle hill, into the charming, as he's saying, Italian garden. So the Italian garden, it's a bit tricky because the date, as you can see, is 1774. We were discussing with the colleagues, and according to the translator, he's a historian, this text is interesting, of course, but historically not very eloquent. And the fact that the garden has been set up until then, a lot of work had been put on. And of course, it was mentioned Italian style. So it is really, as the priest who wrote understood. And it's already historical specifics. There are unclear places in the text. For example, it was mentioned in Mrs. Eleonora Gelgut later, she got married and became Vereshchinska, and but when the text was written, she was only 5 years old. So we don't know exactly if this is the daughter or maybe some sister or somebody from the family, so still we need to do some homework. But anyway, for us, it's very interesting. And then this term, Italian garden, it's also not entirely clear, because the last quarter of the 18th century, the Baroque regular garden and English landscape garden coexist together in the same time. And for example, in one family, different properties, different estates could be, two different styles developed. And we have some examples like this in the Lithuania and Poland as well. So maybe, this mentioning by the priest Italian is rather means that it's not ours or different somehow. Maybe this is the way what he was trying to say. Anyway, and these lines are quite interesting. In the very, very end, there are a few lines which I think it's very interesting, because the author says that if what this woman did in the park, he said, if the government statements would do the same, the country would flourish. So it's a very beautiful ending, as the priest, I think he was marvelously doing speeches. Yeah, so, however, but it is still possible, of course, that the garden mentioned in the epigram is still Baroque, but we don't know, of course. The only more specific, maybe detail mentioned with the garden work is design the mountain, leveling the surface of terrain, so it was flattened something. So, if for English garden, you need to flatten, but sometimes you need to make hills as well. It is... if the idea as a parterre, maybe this is the concept. So this could be maybe the key, but this is very too little to discuss. Because the classical reconstruction of the castle started actually after only 10 years when this old epigram was written. So it's not still clear. And now I made, a very attractive topic of the title of this paper I'm giving, Anglo-Chinois, so English-Chinese garden. So now I'll tell you why we can also call this garden not only English, but also some Chinese. In the late 18th century, the creation of the new landscape garden in Panemunė was started by the new owner, Antonianu Furgelgut, and he was elder of Samogitia. So basically, he was ruling today's half of the Lithuania, of today's territory. So a very high ranked person in the Kingdom of Poland and Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And if we talk about we already maybe talk about it today, about what is suitable. So in the 18th century, they were, in French books, they using terms decorum, bienséance. So of course, this is one of the things what you must have if you are such a high-ranked dignitary as he was, so to have a good park. So definitely it's one of the reasons why he needs to remodel not only the castle, but all the grounds, because it was the integral structure. And most probably the garden was designed before 1793, so when he was just elected as a new ruler of the territory, and in 10 years probably the works started. And the best glory times of this landscape English-Chinese garden was before 1793 and 1832. So around less than 50 years, it was the time when the park was created and developed. And so the sad story of this castle, that it is also became a kind of a symbol, because in 1831, in Lithuania was already apart for 30 years, annexed by Russian Empire. And the grandson of the person who created the park, he was the uprising leader in Lithuania, and the uprising was lost, and he was killed, and his brother had to withdraw the country, and now they are living in the United Kingdom. So this castle became also kind of a symbol of the country which is not existing anymore. And to talk more about this park, you know, this is the earliest pictures we have, not pictures, almost imaginary picture. But the best, if we talk about the inventories and written sources, is the inventory. We have inventories, the first one in 1826, so still from the times when the garden was blooming. And in this inventory, we have quite rough description what plants and how the garden looks like. So it was mentioned that various fruit trees and fruit bushes they were, and so it was mentioned, we can imagine that it was a regular plan as well, and with a fence and gate, and mentioned canals, which in this case means ponds, not straight canals, of course, and the water drainage equipment, so wooden valves and grates, which later were changed, and from them water were flowing in the stone cascade, which were mentioned, and one on which was one adorned with the sculpture of Venus. And another pond was having the walled stone walls around. And also a fruit garden was connected to the rest of the park. It is not detailed too much in inventory, but the buildings also mentioned pavilions, bridges, cascades, and so on, and other enlightenment elements which were important, which I'll come back very soon. Well, in this inventory in 1826, it was not mentioned, you know, what exactly style park is, and it was very interesting discussion how the contemporaries were calling this park, and because in that period, you know, in our territory, we could find such a terminology for the landscape garden as landscape, picturesque, English. It was in Polish ogród angielski, or English Chinese, or simply just parks, or sometimes wild, romantic, sentimental, or even strolling gardens. So many terminology, names were used for these kind of parks. And in the same actually year, in 1826, one important park researcher, Polish Count Stanisław Wojcicki, he described this garden as English garden, actually, which was later repeated the same terminology by another park specialist like Józef Strumilo, who was in 1811 founded the Botanical Garden in Vilnius, actually, and in 1820 published 3 volumes on the gardens of the North, which is very famous, actually. got 7 editions in the 19th century. The latest one, the 7th one, in 1883. And another park researcher, Theodor Triplin, actually he was a doctor, traveler, traveled all across Europe, Africa, and also Lithuania. And he described also this park in the diary from his trips in Lithuania as English garden. So this designation, as well as the characteristic structures described, and allow us this park, this garden, to be described as landscape, of course. However, it must be also stated that and the inventory, the description I was mentioned, it's not incomplete and uneven. The park, the Panemunė garden, was dominated, of course, by local species. Probably many of the old trees had grown naturally, and it was integrated into greeneries. And so this is especially, of course, there are some introduced species which are very popular during the 19th century in the area, and so there are around 40 species which we can count now. The oldest tree we have, it's 400 years old oak, and so a researcher, a park researcher who was doing a research on this park actually state that simultaneous publications and analogs of other parks and the iconography of Panemunė garden allow us to state that the characteristic vegetation of landscape parks prevails in the park and planted to highlight the natural environment of the castle. So basically the castle itself became the very much important element of this landscape garden. And also important, the typical this as I mentioned, other trees, so the groups of black poplars or old willows or white poplars or another shrubs which are not local but really beautifully matched with the local plants. And in this period, probably the only regularly planned groups of gardens were fruit gardens. And of course the flower beds in front of the castle, which is partly, you can see that. The variety and the purposes of styles of small architecture, with some of the, the pavilions and bridges we see here, in the Romantic garden had a symbolic expression of the diversity of the world and the universality of the garden. And it could be another full lecture on this, some symbolic means on this garden particularly. But let's take it briefly and let's look what kind of pavilions we have. In Lithuania, as elsewhere in Europe, the fashion of gardens spread together with the iconographic program and specific types of building that were established already in Rococo gardens was developed. And since early 19th century, increasing lithograph and reprints and books were one of the places where circulated all the ideas. And there were also local publishers who work on these topics. And so it was required that the buildings and small garden buildings also could be serving as a practical, but also could have a symbolic purposes. And of course, so it was emphasized the harmony of the function and form. That was important. And in the same garden, it is proposed to build houses of several different styles. Greek, for example, Chinese, Bengali, African or American, but avoiding the just exposition, away from residential houses somewhere hidden in the shrubs and the groves, and to design different spaces. So in English park of Panemunė Castle, it was transformed into English-Chinese garden by garden architecture. If we talk, why we could call it Chinese, because in the inventory it was described Chinese pavilion, gazebo, which was square and had 12 pillars. It was red, with the 3 doors, 2 of which were glazed, and built of fir wood. At the back of the pavilion, it was semicircular window made of variously arranged glasses, and it's called Gothic. So it's a Gothic element in Chinese pavilion. And the walls were covered with a canvas, and it had a portrait of Poniatowski. Here we don't know if it was the last king of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania or his brother, Prince Joseph Poniatowski, but it was quite common. These are the parks from the Warsaw. And nearby the capital was summer residence of the lost king, and it was also highlighted in the park, these Chinese elements. But not only here, and also not far from Warsaw, it was another estate with actually as well, Michał Poniatowski, the brother of king. He also had these Chinese elements. So it was quite common, and if we look at the, in general, who was the Antoni Gielgud, the owner of this estate, he was very close to the king court, and he was very supporting the king. So these are not accidentally appearing, actually. And in general, in the whole park, there were more Gothic elements, bridges, more pavilions, and also antique sculptures like Flora, Venus, and so on. But also very important elements were the oak trees, from the old oak grove, and also the castle itself, as I mentioned. During the 19th century, the castle, after it was sequestrated, taken by the Russian authorities as a punishment of organizing the uprising, the castle became neglected. And actually until 2 years ago, so for almost 200 years, the castle has been in a neglectance. So the castle during the 19th century, during the Romanticism, became an inspiration for the travelers. They were traveling and taking drawings, watercolors, then later, which could be reborn as a prints and published in the magazines. So the castle was very important inspiration. And of course, the very important road was pathed, so from Kaunas, middle of Lithuania, to Memel, the city you already know. It is the oldest, probably, the road which was pathed in the 19th century in a modern sense. And this castle was on that road. So for us, it's very good till today because it's on this historical road. And the 20th century is the time when the castle became a national property. It was nationalized already in the pre-war, and it was discussed what to do for a long time. So firstly, in the pre-war, it was a monastery, very shortly, for 5 years established, and some works started in 1939, but very little done, though the project was prepared. And the new chapel was built in the former probably Gothic or Chinese pavilion place. A new chapel was built. And instead of the Serpentine Hill, a new topic was developed that these two hills are not the romantic part elements, but these are the tombs of the Grand Duke Vytautas and his wives. So some, Poniatowski was not interesting anymore. The medieval times was more interesting in the 30s of the 20th century. And also the wooden part of the ponds were changed into the concrete. So these are from the 30s of the 20th century. And the park was somehow also renewed during the communistic period. For example, here is the picture from the 80s. And now we are developing the last stage. So this is the project prepared in 2019, which is supposed to be done in 4 stages. Now we finished the first stage, just all around the path around the castle. So this is one of the exhibitions about the plants. As I said, it's 40 over species. So this is, but this is not a reconstruction of the English-Chinese garden, of course. This is just the adaptation for the tourist needs. So don't expect pagodas, don't expect Chinese pavilions and Venus and florists in the islands and rabbits islands as well. So this is just the beginning, and in the next, I hope, some years, I cannot tell how long it will take, we'll plan to finish. And for the ending, I think winter picture is very popular today. So I was very happy when it was shown before. So thank you for the questions, and in the future if you have, and please again text me if you have more. Thank you very much.